for joining us. You have tuned in to the eCommerceaholic Friday afternoon live stream. My name's TJ Gamble, and today we're going to be talking about another interesting topic that I think is very applicable, and we're going to talk about fraud prevention. Now, as always with these topics, I want to go and find someone that is an expert, someone that can go as deep as you guys want to go on this topic and answer any and all questions you might be able to come up with. And there's one name that really stands out if you're talking about fraud and fraud prevention, and that is Signified. So I reached out to Signified, and this live stream's been quite a bit of time in the works, but those conversations led us to Stefan Nedzik. Or excuse me, I butchered your name there, didn't I? Right off the bat, Nanzik, Stefan Nanzik. See, first mistake already with no technical glitches, and I'm going to butcher a name. I apologize, Stefan, but let us know why, if we're going to talk about fraud, why should we be talking to Signified and kind of what your role is there at the company?
Well, thanks for having me. And no worries, like the name is not very common here, so people pronounce it in all sorts of fashions, and I'm used to that. So let me talk to you a little bit more about Signified and myself there. So Signified is a Silicon Valley-based startup. I joined the company a little bit more than 4 years ago. I was number 17, so the company was still really small. I actually then wore all sorts of hats. Like for a while, I actually ran the product management team, so very familiar with our product roadmap and how to successfully deal with fraud. I started the marketing department, so a lot of our public messaging is coming out of my writing, if you will. And then today, in this day and age, I'm mainly focusing on our corporate communications. So this is like everything in regards to how we tell our story, how we actually reach out to communities, how we actually make sure that we're relevant to the world right now and in the future. So when it comes to what we actually do, we started the company as a company. Like two of our founders, Raj and Mike, they're actually like veterans when it comes to fraud prevention for the big and established companies like PayPal, FedEx. And they started this journey with the vision of these enterprise-grade solutions should be available to the whole market. So they started like their own company, introduced technology like social graph, machine learning, and really made that available as a fraud detection solution for everyone in the e-commerce space, like selling through different platforms and plugins. But then really through that journey, discovering that what people don't want to do is actually have a tool that just gives them another piece of data point. What they really wanted to do is get peace of mind, have a company like us provide them with the tools, knowledge, and service to take the problem off their plate and give them peace of mind so that they can actually go back to what they originally wanted to do, which is really run a successful and build a successful e-commerce business. Because let's face it, nobody went into e-commerce to say, I want to be really the best in class when it comes to managing fraud.
Definitely. So we're going to start with my questions, which my questions are always kind of basic and overarching. And if you have any questions, if you're watching right now, we are streaming live on Periscope, Twitter, and we're on YouTube. Now, these may be embedded on other platforms, Facebook, LinkedIn, and if you're watching this on one of those, hop on over to YouTube and catch the actual conversation that's going on over there. Ask your questions there, and we will be able to answer any and all of them. So I'm going to start with mine. You guys always ask the best questions, so get them in, and we will address them as soon as we possibly can. So let's just kind of talk about fraud. Like how big of a problem is that? How many merchants are actually affected by fraud?
Well, that's actually a good question. I would almost argue there is a function of maturity when it comes to a retailer or like an e-commerce merchant. Like when you're just getting started and you're kind of like building your business, you go out on Shopify, sign up for your store, build out like your experience. Normally, like you struggle a lot of times like to get like to the place where you have your first orders come in. And obviously in this time frame, fraud is not going to be a problem. Like nobody's trying to steal from you because in reality, nobody knows that the store really exists yet. But then there comes this point in the maturity life cycle of a company when they really make it like their brand, their unique selling proposition kind of like takes off. Like you actually make it into the Google index, like your ad campaigns may show momentum and traffic. And all of a sudden you have like a decent amount of orders kind of like hitting your e-commerce business. And at the same time, what happens is fraudsters will actually get this new brand on the radar, knowing that like particularly younger companies, particularly like companies that just got started, typically don't really have a lot of defense in play yet. So it may be a lot easier to kind of hit them. So from that perspective, to go back to the question, like how big of a problem that is, like who has that problem, like any merchant that sells a significant amount of like orders online and actually like has to process that will be hit with fraud. And then the question is just how do they react with it? Like how do they actually address the problems there?
So is there like an average amount that costs each business? Like how much is kind of typical? What would you expect your fraud to be if you're an e-commerce merchant?
Right. So there are a couple of data points. It's typically percentages and not absolutes. So the magic number is almost always around like a 1% of your GMV or sales volume, kind of like being a fraud number. If you go above that, like your credit card, like the payment gateway providers, they will actually start putting you on high risk or even block lists. So you actually potentially lose the opportunity to even transact in e-commerce. So that's, if you will, the maximum. The minimum obviously is zero. Like if you just got started, if you have a product that no fraudster actually wants, you may actually have a 0% fraud loss rate. There are a couple of like outlying products that are something like that. Because if you think about fraud, like fraud themselves, like fraudsters, they are entrepreneurs of themselves. Like there's very often a misconception of like who a fraudster really is. Like it's not like this guy in a hoodie, like student that does this as a sidekick. It's normally like an organized crime kind of like approach. So those are entrepreneurs who really want to monetize an opportunity. So what they need is a certain circumstance of like a product that has a secondary market so that they can easily monetize and scale. Scaling is an important piece. Like if you buy or if you kind of purchase something in a fraudulent way that is not valuable enough, it's going to be really hard logistically just to scale this to the point that you can really monetize this well as a fraudster. So the sizing really depends on all of these different aspects. But as a good North Star is like, as soon as you start getting something closer to the 1%, like normally would say everything about 50 basis point, like 0.5%, is an alarming signal that you should really reconsider what you're doing on your fraud side, because there are things that can be done in order to avoid these things.
All right, there's something there I got to know more about. Give me an example of a product that fraudsters are not interested in.
Well, I mean, a lot of like the perishable goods, for example, or even customized goods, like things like a mug that has like your baby photos kind of like put into the mug as like a custom giveaway. It's really hard to monetize something like that because it's so custom, so unique. To scale that is really hard. The other extreme would be something like a GoPro camera. It's like, I mean, high ticket value item. Everybody wants one. Very easy to find a secondary market where to dump that, where some like markets are not so keen on like really knowing where the product came from as long as they get a good discount on it. So I think that's kind of like the other extreme. So a lot of like the cheaper products like groceries, a lot of like the departmental store items are actually fairly low frauded because again, it's hard to monetize that, and think of that resale toilet paper, it's really hard to do.
So is that typical fraud? I mean, is that what merchants are seeing, or are there other things out there as well? Is it just people purchasing products and then trying to resell them, or are there other things that merchants should be concerned about when it comes to fraud?
So I think when it comes to fraud, like it's really the biggest problem, the way that we think of that. I mean, we started the journey coming from a loss prevention perspective. So it was all about, oh, people have chargebacks. I mean, maybe also to elaborate that for maybe people who aren't that familiar with this context. But in a credit card transaction in a store called a card present transaction, like the credit card company is actually fully liable for the losses occurred from a chargeback. Chargeback means when the consumer decides that they saw something on their bill that wasn't them and they just tell their bank, it's like, hey, that wasn't me, I want my money back. Consumer always gets a default kind of like approval, so they get the money back, and then the merchant kind of needs to confirm that this was actually a legit transaction, or if not, actually sit on the loss. If this was due to stolen identity / fraud in a card present, like in an in-store physical environment, like the credit card companies actually take that liability. In a so-called card not present transaction, which all e-commerce transactions fall into that, the liability is actually with the merchant. So that is, if you will, the crux of the problem of why fraud prevention in e-commerce is so much of a more important problem, because the liability, and with this, the loss actually sits with the merchant. So we started the journey really thinking about that problem primarily, to say, how do we take the chargeback loss, the chargeback cost amount off the merchant so that they don't have to worry about that any longer, which obviously requires merchants that have a decent amount of like chargeback losses, hence somebody who's been targeted by some semi, if not professional fraud rings. What we learned though in the journey and working with customers very, very closely is that we learned that the biggest impact or negative kind of like aspect of what fraud does to you as an e-commerce business is not necessarily the pure loss number of chargebacks that you actually have to pay. But as soon as merchants start doing something about that, like preventing fraud, we sometimes call this an avoidance strategy or a fear-led strategy to fraud. Like you're afraid that you're going to get chargebacks from fraudsters. So what you start doing is actually be a lot more cautious in your order reviews. You actually start looking at orders and determine, this one looks sketchy. Let me actually cancel the order and stay on the safe side. So a lot of that starts happening. And this is what we call walking away from good revenue out of fear of fraud. And that number, like if I'm, again, quoting some percentages on average in the United States, like I think the loss rate on chargebacks was around 0.8%, 1%-ish for the overall fraud industry. The declines due to fear of fraud are more like in the 2.5% range. So more than double the impact from an actual business loss to the merchant comes from the fact that they reject orders without knowing whether they actually are fraudulent or not, hence turning a lot of good orders away because of they look sketchy, they may not have enough data, it may not fit into the pattern that they could recognize. And that, if you will, is the biggest impact to the actual bottom line of the customer. And if you translate that also to the customer experience for the consumer making purchases, because if you go to a store and you buy an order and that one gets canceled, I mean, that's not good customer experience. And in a day and age where everybody competes on customer experience with the big digital natives and like the big A, it's really hard if you have to sacrifice these customer experience moments.
So 2 to 2.5% out of fear. Now, just to make sure I'm clear on that, is that all orders that they cancel out of fear, including ones that might have proven to be fraudulent? Or is that 2 to 2.5% that they've canceled that somehow proved to not be fraudulent? Right? I want to make sure, are they actually losing 2 to 2.5%, or is a percentage of those actually probably fraudulent that they just avoided?
No, the actual fraud amount is in that number. So if you do the math, like you probably have like a 2.5% rejection, and then like half a percent is probably true fraud in that segment. So the ones that they falsely declined, if you will, could be like in the range around 2%, which actually does match up. Like when we get merchants and onboarded and we actually run them through our engine, we very often see like a revenue lift on their end, like in the 2, 3, 4%, depending on how mature the current fraud management process actually is. And that one comes without an increase in chargebacks. So it's just really like weeding out the ones that are falsely declined, or an analyst talk, like this is false positives, and kind of weeding them out kind of like creates like an immediate boost to top line revenue in e-commerce by switching to a customer first kind of like fraud prevention solution rather than a fear-led one.
So are we seeing any, increase in a particular type of fraud? Are there any trends that you're noticing lately in the industry?
Yeah, I mean, there are obviously fraud is, I mean, you're dealing with a malicious opponent. So the interesting piece on that is the other side never sleeps. So they evolve, they actually develop new attacks, new methods. So whatever worked like 2 years ago is not going to work today any longer. So your fraud defense, if you will, always has to evolve with the trends in the market. I think the biggest, most recent wave that we've seen is because out of fear of fraud, like what we've seen is like a lot of merchants put friction into the buying journey in order to be more secure. So it's this trade-off between security and convenience on the buyer side. So examples of that one would be to force people to log into a account that they have with you as a merchant in order to complete the checkout rather than to allow guest checkout. which is actually an element of friction because, I mean, to be honest, like who really wants to have all these passwords and credentials and remembers them? But what has happened, like this started kind of spreading. And then the most recent fraud trends that kind of like parallel this, because obviously fraud reacts to this, is that the so-called account takeover fraud is like now one of the most dominant fraud patterns out there. Account takeover fraud really means a fraud ring or fraud organization is doing a very concerted effort in order to take over the accounts of specific users and people. So this is really username password combination in order to take the account and then do something with these accounts. And the fun thing, or the fun fact on that one, I think this was this, it was on the rise like year to year, 80% growth in account takeover fraud that different vendors have been seeing. The interesting pattern, if you really think about like why this is spiraling out of control, is we all read the headlines, like there's constant data breaches somewhere. And if you think about what the average person actually does on the consumer side, they typically use the same combination of email address and password on so many different platforms that no matter whether that breach actually like is what that retailer or like that other company kind of like is using for the credentials, the chance that some users are actually using the same set of credentials now makes yourself a target, even though you yourself haven't been breached at all. The data set is just out there and available. And then with the dark web, which is now really like, think of that as an eBay place where criminals can go and shop for stolen credentials, stolen credit card data, stolen account data, and get huge data sets, and then have machine learning automated attacks that kind of just test out like which one of these accounts work on what platforms. And then someone else actually buys that information of like, hey, this combination works on those sites, and they actually run the exploit on that. So I think the learning from that trend is really that as the e-commerce space has tried to address like one of the security concerns by introducing like more reliance on account login scenarios, the fraud space has reacted and actually made just like really good on their end to steal that information, to trade that information, to make that like really scalable again. And so now we're back to the point that you could almost argue the additional friction that you put in front of the consumer in order to have a login experience is probably not worth it if the protection layer that you get from that is almost like neglectable or getting worse as we progress over time. And at the same time, you created like this consumer experience friction, which you could just take out if you didn't require that in the first place. So I think that's one of the macro trends that are currently out in the industry, driven by, I believe, these two factors of like the breaches and the readily available kind of marketplaces for stolen credential and criminal data.
Keep your questions coming in the chat if you have them. We're here to answer your questions. I have a ton of questions of my own and topics to cover, so we'll be able to get through the hour without you, but it's not going to be as entertaining or as useful if you don't have questions for us to answer. If you're new around here, consider hitting that subscribe button, tapping that notification bell, so you'll be notified each and every time we post new content. If you happen to be watching this somewhere else like Twitter or LinkedIn or Facebook, just go ahead and give us a follow. It's the same thing as a subscribe. It's just a different word. So again, I'm looking in the chat here to see if we have any questions before I get into the next topic here. Okay, looks like we've got some conversation going on there, but no questions as of yet. So I wanted to talk about kind of a different perspective on fraud. And, you know, I haven't spent a lot of time thinking about it from this perspective, so I wanted to get your thoughts on it. You know, as merchants or as agencies who help merchants, we spend a lot of time thinking about these things. From a consumer perspective, you know, how does that look? Like, are they aware of fraud? Is it something that enters their mind? Have you done any studies? Have you seen any information on how consumers look at fraud?
Sure. It's actually a very important point. As I mentioned, like as a company, we evolve more and more towards not considering the problem just a loss prevention problem, not just a security problem, but really the mitigation, like to protect commerce being this moment when consumers and sellers are actually getting together to transact, and protecting that fragile moment, if you will. So that led us down a journey of not just like treating most of our product development from a customer first, which really means consumer experience first kind of point of view, but also, to your point, like brought the consumer more into the spotlight of how do they actually feel, like how do they perceive all of these things. Like we noticed the first study that we actually run was more around friction, like what are the friction points that consumers are actually really like annoyed about. And there were interesting stats that came out there. It's like I think it was in the higher 40s that people get frustrated about redirects in the checkout process. Like you probably all have experience like this. Oh, it's going through a secondary website, something like a Secure by Visa or something, and then you need to do secondary authentication, like maybe like a code that comes through an SMS. Like all of these friction points are actually being considered like frustration in the buying and checkout process. Very often, so when you're actually legitimately kind of use, for example, somebody else's account, like your wife's account, but you don't happen to have a phone, so now you can't do the PIN authentication or things like that. So that was the first kind of like study that we've done to really mainly look into the friction caused by some fraud concerns. But we then also got a little bit more curious and like how aware or sensitive are consumers actually when it comes to the theft angle or to the actual fraud angle. So we asked them more questions about like, hey, do you believe your data set is actually available in the dark web for purchase? And I think that was a very interesting stat that we got from that one. Like in this panel, like about 30-ish% actually said they're pretty certain that their data set is out there in the web and that you can buy it there, which is actually an interesting fact if you think of how okay we are as a society that our data is just like floating there and criminals can just have access to it. But also like the understanding, like if you had a negative fraud experience with a merchant, that was another very interesting question. If you got like a fraud chargeback on your bank account and you actually went through the process of like disputing that, would you give any negative kind of credibility points to the merchant that was showing up on that statement? And that was actually another number that like a significant amount of like the consumers actually did consider this a negative on the merchant side, even though, if you will, like, I mean, it was a stolen credential site, so the merchant wasn't really at fault. But making sure that you minimize these things actually seems to be crucial. The other interesting angle, and this may actually breach a little bit out from your question that you originally asked, but there's also like the notion of consumers starting to file chargebacks, not necessarily really because their card has been used by someone else, but for other reasons. So sometimes this is called like the friendly fraud scenario. So they may not have recognized, for example, the line item because some merchants do this. They actually have a different name on their credit card processor than like their store is called. So when like I see this on my invoice statement, I can't recognize this transaction, and I say, well, this is obviously fraud. I never made that order. So I kind of file a chargeback for that. It's almost an accidental chargeback. Like if they knew who the merchant was, they would not have filed the chargeback, but now it's there. So now it needs to be mitigated, disputed, which is another cumbersome process that merchants actually have to go through. In this case, to make sure that their bank and their payment gateways are not considering them a bad business and taking like their ability away from taking credit card statements in the first place. So the role of the consumer and all of that is getting more and more interesting. And I think as a company, we are fascinated about exactly this intersection of like how the consumer and the buyer kind of need to transact together, do this in a way that the convenience on the consumer side is not affected, but at the same time that the security on the seller side is also kind of like at bay, so that these two things kind of are balanced to protect that this commerce moment will actually still happen and it's not destroyed by all of these outside threats that are kind of like threatening it from existence and scale.
So is that ultimately kind of what happens if you have high fraud? I mean, do you lose your ability to transact? Your bank is going to, or your processor is going to kick you off their platform? Are they going to charge you a lot more? Does that follow you from one processor to another? Like if you're not doing a good job of taking care of this, ultimately what's the risk as a merchant?
Right. I mean, I think there are a couple kind of like scenarios of how this can turn into a disaster. I mean, knowing that e-commerce business, we really deal with very thin margins. And if you think of total loss on a product, you lose the actual amount that this product costs, not your margin. So how much more of that product would you have to sell in order to make up for this total cost of product, in order to kind of get back into the goods? So there's actually a story mainly for smaller merchants that like even smaller amounts of high value chargebacks, like single orders that are kind of like being frauded, could technically, from just financial perspective, like get close to bankruptcy or even into bankruptcy, just because this thin margin that you need to do to catch up on like actual loss of product. So I think that's the first problem in the maturity that merchants deal with. Like, as soon as they have a significant amount of like business going on, they have a fraud prevention strategy in place, they typically are not being killed by the chargeback cost themselves any longer. The next hurdle then is actually the chargeback rate. This talks to the point that you just made. If your chargebacks, if your fraud rate is kind of like not totally under control, you're always going to be kind of like on the high risk list of like your payment gateways. High risk means they actually put you on a higher tier, so they charge you more. But it also means you can't really indefinitely like be on these different lists. So if it's still kind of not under control, some of them will give you an ultimatum. Some of them will actually just cancel service directly. Then you can try to find specific gateways that are more risk tolerant. Like, I mean, there are even product specific ones. I know for the longest time, it was a huge issue, particularly here in the United States, to find a payment gateway that would actually do high risk products like e-cigarettes, for example, because they're considered to be somewhat related to the drug markets. So there were actually payment gateways who categorically just said like e-cigarettes and stuff like that cannot be transacted on our payment gateway. So you needed to find a specialized payment gateway that actually would do that. And with that, obviously, came a higher cost and price point. So fighting like this chargeback rate number is, if you will, the second stage of maturity. Once you get that one under control, and let's say you are in the healthy like 0.5%, like 75 basis point rate of fraud, that's really when you realize that dealing with all of that, the cost of like dealing with fraud, like you typically at that point need manual review. You have to have some people reviewing orders. All of that piles up to a cost of operating fraud, which is the second thing that is actually going to be hard to scale as you grow. Because now you think of holiday season, all of a sudden you have this huge spike in traffic. If you have any manual component in your order flow, which a manual fraud review is a manual component, all of a sudden you have this huge spike in traffic. So your orders get delayed. Either you bring down quality and kind of like do faster reviews, but then lose quality again, or you actually do them thoroughly, but then all of the orders get delayed and customer satisfaction kind of goes down. So like this whole operational scalability thing becomes like the next problem, which is really managing operational expenses from that matter. And then once you also manage that one and you actually have enough cost allocated to managing fraud, that's typically when most companies become more or mature enough to really understand that they will have a false positive rate. And it is actually not that easy to figure out how big your false positive rate actually is. How many good customers are you now turning away because of your current fraud defense? It's not an easy number to identify, because if you really think through what you would have to do to figure out what that number is either you ship out the products that you believe are fraudulent just to confirm that they come back as a chargeback, fully intending to get a full chargeback cost on it, losing product, which again in thin margins is something most companies cannot afford to do at scale, or assess or like estimate your false positive rate, like maybe taking a more senior fraud professional, looking at all of your declines and determining, well, this one should not have been declined, this one should not have been declined, this one should not have been declined. But then you have no confirmation that this person was actually right now. So if you had shipped these orders, would they really not have come back as a chargeback? So really getting a solid false positive rate is really hard, and hence optimizing on this balance of like, are we declining too much? Are we too conservative? Is really like a hard thing to do for a merchant.
And I wanted to make sure I gave credit to Talesh for this question. He asked a very similar question about the same time. Hopefully, Talesh, that answered your question. If not, clarify or ask some sort of more specific version of that, and we'll make sure we get it addressed. We do have a couple of questions here in the chat. Karthik, thanks for watching. You are here just about each and every week and always asking great questions, and I appreciate it. Karthik's question is, do you support single store view in Magento, and what's the current pricing? And I'm going to clarify a little bit. I assume what Karthik means with single store view is in Magento you can have multiple store views, multiple websites under one platform. Could I, if I had one that was really high risk, could I install Signified only on that website? Now, that's a pretty technical question, but then what does your pricing look like?
Right. So on the small business side, we actually have a try and buy model. So if you go to the Shopify App Store, for example, you would actually find a 14-day trial, go through that. List pricing for that one is 1% of the GMV that we're processing and guaranteeing. And maybe in this context, I also need to elaborate a little what we actually do from a service side. Because unlike most other fraud detection tools, we're not just like looking at the orders, giving you a decision of like this is good, this is bad, or even like the data of like this is why this is good or this is why this is bad. Like we actually come back with all of that plus a decision of like go ahead and ship this, and if this turns into a chargeback, we reimburse that chargeback cost, including shipping fees and processing fees and all of that, so that you can really automate against that decision. And that's a concept that we call guaranteed fraud protection, which is now becoming its own product category and is actually seen as like the future of how fraud prevention, fraud management in the future in e-commerce is evolving to. That model, if you will, combines big data, machine learning, and this liability shift, this insurance component, puts all of that together so that merchants don't have to worry about that at all and can automate against that without the risk of like, do I trust this fraud solution now? Like, do I trust this score or whatever data point like the fraud detection tool actually has given me? So again, in the self-service world, like our list price is 1% of these orders. You can just put credit card on file, self-activate, and kind of like be done. As we move more into mid-market, typically the setup is more custom-based. So we actually have a conversation. We take a sample of like the audience or the population that goes through the e-commerce practice. Our customer success team can do all sorts of implementation. I mean, from like a pretty much plugin ready to play Magento plugin that we have. We're natively embedded in Magento 2.2 and above. So if you go to the admin console, there's a fraud section and you can actually find Signified services there and activate them there. But to these custom setups, like the variations are pretty much endless. Like technically, once you go more up market, you typically go to an actual like straightforward API integration, which allows you to customize like any aspect of that. And then also when it comes to pricing, at that point, it's the population, it's a sample of that. There's risk analysis that goes into this. There's going to be an ROI model that actually compares like the typical loss rate, operational costs, and kind of false declines before, our expectations where this is going to be after. Based on that, the pricing model is being developed and then kind of like run by the merchants so that they can actually see how much of a ROI lift they're going to get from that. If you guys are curious, there's actually a Forrester TI study, like a total economic impact study on our website that talks about like an enterprise merchant that went to a guaranteed fraud protection model, and their ROI was like 380% increase based on mainly these different aspects that benefit the value equation there.
Hopefully that answered your question there, Karthik. If not, please clarify, and we will do all we can to get you an answer. Keep those questions coming, and we will keep just blazing through them. Again, if you happen to be catching this on any other platform other than YouTube, the conversation is going on over there. I hope we have access to stream on LinkedIn and some of these other platforms very soon. The next question in the queue here is from Talesh, and Talesh asks, what measures does Signified take to properly anonymize customer data and purchasing habits?
Right. So what we're actually doing is we don't do any people-centric data. So this is actually crucial to us. Like we're a very data-sensitive company. This kind of goes into this whole, like we take our relationship to the consumer space fairly serious. So we have like the different certifications like in place that you would expect. But also when it comes to like what a lot of people would probably simplify of what a fraud solution does it profiles builds like people profiles, and then some people even mix this up with a credit scoring kind of like thinking. This is actually not how an engine like Signify works. Like we're actually a transactional screening engine. So we look at like the transaction level and look at like how the patterns that we identify on that particular transaction map to the likelihood of this being like a fraudulent case. So it's a lot of like relationship building, like all the different pieces. We do anonymize a lot of the data points that we store. So for example, we don't like actually store or have any credit card numbers in our system whatsoever, in order to, again, protect anonymities and really the consumer space there, and then tying these things together to that point.
Again, hope that answered your question, and we're just going to keep going through the questions here. Karthik asks another question here. Is there a way Signify can block the fraud orders before the credit card payment is captured?
Right. So there are actually, this goes into the custom setups. Like the out of the box actually is a post authentication or authorization on the credit card. But there are scenarios when you actually want to have this before. It's a trade-off that you make. Like before, you don't have like that much data that you have after. So typically we recommend you only do this if you have to. Like if there's a good reason for why you need to have real-time transactions, let's say in-game or digital only scenarios of that sort, then it actually does make sense to do the pre-transaction setup. It can be set up that way. This is all part of the custom implementation. The ready-made plugins that we have in the app stores, like they wouldn't actually do that behavior because we optimize more on the approval rate, and to maximize that one, like the post auth, just gives you a lot more options to weed out like the ones that are potentially like false declines. But technically possible. It will be a conversation with an implementation professional on our end.
Great questions, everyone. As always, if we don't get your answer right, clarify in the chat. We've got another one here from Telesh. Another great question here, Telesh. What measures does Signify take to make sure their service doesn't affect merchant site performance? Like, what does your burst capacity look like?
So, I mean, I'm not necessarily like one of our technicians, so I can probably not talk to the technical level of that. Happy to get you in touch like with one of our kind of sales representatives and kind of like address those things. Normally, like again, the main implementation that we have is post authentication, which really means we're not interjecting into the order flow at all. So that means worst case, let's say if there was a delay on our processing, let's say holiday peak season, Black Friday, and we are actually like a couple of like minutes behind, like the order flow wouldn't be disrupted at all. Which is actually one of the advantages of doing this post-transaction. If this was in a pre-setup, again, this is all custom. There would have to be kind of like certain allocations being made in order to verify that the throughput is actually guaranteeable, that there's an SLA around that. But typically, this is all part of the SLA setup with our enterprise clients to make sure that the expectations that they have from a throughput perspective, from a response time perspective, they're all known, that they're all agreed upon, and that they are also being provided by the technology stack underneath. I remember that in the earlier days, like this was a lot more of a problem, like when we were a much smaller company, like anecdotally. I don't know whether you guys remember that, but flash sales at some point were a big thing that were new. And there were things when like even big platforms like Shopify's of the world were really worried about like if some of these celebrities throw their flash sales out there and they actually process like millions of dollars in like a few minute time frame, like how do we really operate them? And I remember we had these all hands moments where we had this on a big screen, actually looked at all the metrics, that half the engineering team was on standby just to verify that nothing breaks in these moments. But honestly, I haven't seen like these major events in a long time any longer. So I figure at this point, the maturity of the product, the scale actually has really reached a point where these pinpoint moments are no longer really an issue when it comes to that.
We have a comment here from Autostrada Pilot. Autostrada Pilot, I don't recognize your name, so not sure if this is the first time you're watching, but I appreciate you commenting in the chat and definitely appreciate you watching the live stream. And this is really more of a comment but wanted to make sure we touched on this. We talked about it a little bit earlier, but it never hurts to rehash what I think is a very important point. And, if being classified as high risk, over that 1% can lead to fines by card networks that can be thousands of dollars, your accounts being shut off. Do you have any stories or maybe tales of woe of this happening to a merchant, or maybe some prevalent or relevant, examples?
Right. I mean, in all fairness, like the customers that we're actually working with don't go through this because we would actually do something before they hit that threshold. Because as a fraud company, like you almost have failed when you reach that point. So the anecdotes that we know are mainly like merchants that tell us about their experiences before. I think the one that kind of like stuck in my mind the most, already talked about that, was like merchants who really had a hard time to find a payment gateway that would even take them on because of the kind of products or the kind of audience that they wanted to sell to. So I think that was a very common problem, particularly small businesses wanting to start in a product that like the established payment gateways figured was actually like a high risk scenario. Aside from that, fraud rings are actually a thing. This even hits like larger companies, and it's sometimes very unpredictable. I was alluding a little already to the fact that fraudsters operate like entrepreneurs. So fraud rings are actually like organized fraudsters, if you will, that are kind of like more concentrated on a specific pattern. Like, I mean, you've probably all seen these con art movies, which is kind of like something that is close to how they actually operate. So something that happened to merchants sometimes, and this was very often the introduction of why we're having a conversation with a potential new customer, is that all of a sudden, like out of nowhere, like they are being hit by a fraud ring in France. And then all of a sudden, the French version of their website is completely under attack. They have to close that store because they just can't really manage the chargebacks that they got from that particular store any longer. What we then actually have, and those are, if you will, some of those more interesting stories, kind of like moving to a guarantee model like ours, means that they can open the store again. Like they're still actually going to be hit by fraud in the next probably days, if not weeks. I think it took us about like 3 weeks to get their chargeback, to get the fraud rate actually down to the point that was acceptable. But then, and this is the magic moment that I think a lot of our fraud analysts and our domain experts here enjoy really going through, is to also realize that the other side, like the fraud ring, has understood that the defense of this particular store is now at a level that it doesn't make sense for them any longer to try to exploit them any further. Then they just moved away. So there was this moment where almost like all of a sudden the fraud pressure, call it an industry, kind of completely disappeared, and all of a sudden their fraud rate, acceptance rate, like was back to like a perfect number with no chargebacks coming in. And that's actually like the typical moment when you recognize you battled a fraud ring, you won the battle, they moved away, and all of a sudden it's almost like, well, there's really no fraud any longer at all. Like approval rate is off the roof, no chargebacks coming in, and you're actually not declining that many orders because you're not targeted any longer. I think the worst nightmare is the moment when you see the fraud attack start hitting you. Like when you actually have something in place and all of a sudden something changed. Like you never had an issue, all of a sudden either your engine starts or your current process, practice, whatever you do about fraud, starts rejecting dramatic amounts, and then you're not happy about that. Or you actually start these chargebacks come in, and then all of a sudden you have this huge cost that was unexpected, and then it becomes more of a fire drill to address it.
That's an interesting point. Like, does that present a problem for you where merchants are like, hey, we threw Signified on there, problems averted, we don't have a problem anymore? Or maybe they've had you the whole time and they're like, hey, we don't have any fraud. Maybe we should just cut this loose. And then they realize that, okay, well, they didn't have any fraud because people realized their protections were in place and didn't attack them. Is that something you see frequently?
I mean, you would almost expect, but I think it's, if you think of, again, the maturity of a merchant who has been hit by a fraud ring, who went through this, who won the battle, like normally at that point they have developed a maturity level that they also understand they don't want to go through this again. And since fraud comes in waves, like as soon as you turn off your protection, It's just a matter of time until you're going to be tested by someone again. And if that test comes back positive to this fraud tester, then like they're actually going to start exploiting that again. So trying to time this is almost like the stock market. You could try to time this and say, well, we just defend like a huge fraud ring. So probably we're good kind of like not doing fraud protection for another year before we kind of ramp it up again. But then if you get your timing right, I mean, it just can hurt so badly if it comes unexpected and you have no defense in place, that most mature players wouldn't take that risk and actually put their whole business at risk and their approval rates at risk, for that matter. Another somewhat adjacent use case is some merchants are not necessarily like, it depends again on the maturity on their own kind of like experience when it comes to fraud in different countries and markets. But the global expansion, like if you actually take cross-border and let's say you want to sell in a new market. So for example, like I talked about like those guys who got hit by like a French ring. You may actually not notice that the current approach that you take to fraud only works in the markets that you're in, because, for example, you may have a detection tool that relies on certain data points that are not actually available in this new market that you want to go to. So the fact that they're not available doesn't necessarily mean that those orders are higher risk, but your fraud process that was built on the fact that it assumes that this, let's say, reverse address lookup API, for example, like that it always tells you like who lives at the address that you put in there. If that API comes back and say, I don't know, like that is actually a red flag for the in domain, like in your current like global footprint fraud practice. But then if you did the same thing in a market where reverse address IP data is actually not available at all, like because it may not be compliant to the local privacy or compliance laws, that's all of a sudden not a negative signal, but the process will start declining these orders, assuming that this is a negative signal. So what we've seen a lot is like merchants kind of like almost blindly or without the necessary preparation trying to sell into a new market, being very surprised how dramatically their approval rates dropped, and all of a sudden they only like had 60%, like 50% of the approval rates that they would normally have, which obviously is a big business problem. Like if you try to monetize like a new market and you start declining too many of the orders that you actually get from there. So the rollout, getting into a new market, preparing that well, either internally with vendors, making sure you have the right data set, looking at a sample, like all of that should be part of a very concerted playbook effort as you expand globally and go cross-border. I think right now one of the hottest markets that we've helped merchants get into is China. Because obviously the Chinese consumer space is very different than, let's say, the US-based. So if you took your US-based fraud prevention strategy and without any adjustment kind of rolled that out and tried to now capture the Chinese consumers, like that's not going to work without adjustments.
We've got another question here in the chat from Quentin. Quentin in Austin, Texas. Quentin, thanks for watching this Friday afternoon. And you're right, there's no better end to the week than talking about e-commerce fraud. And Quentin's question here disappeared before I was able to address it, but will there be e-commerceaholic stickers at Imagine? Well, Quentin, I assume you noticed my new stickers here on the laptop. I'm excited that you want e-commerceaholic stickers. I happen to have a lot of these little bundles right here that just came in today, and I will have each and every one of them at Imagine. I'm excited about you asking about them, but I'm also disappointed that nobody asks about Jamerson stickers. And I just like, I need to make that brand more fun. Nobody wants those. So we're going to keep these. I'll bring them. I'll have those too. But thanks for asking about those, and I definitely have some with your name on it. I've got you a glass here as well. Hit me up for that. We've got some other stuff coming. I've got T-shirts coming. I've got the little NASCARs coming that shipped out earlier this week. Hopefully those arrive on time. Be sure to ping me if you happen to be at Imagine. We'll have all of this swag at our booth, which we're to the left, right beside the Magento booth, all the way in the back. It shouldn't be that hard to find, but look us up and collect your swag. We've got another question here from Talesh in the chat. Talesh, thank you for such great questions. You mentioned Fraud Tester. Have you seen scammers actively testing Magento sites for the presence of Signified before attempting fraudulent transactions? Is that something you guys monitor to see whether or not they're checking to see if Signified exists?
I mean, it's actually a fairly good idea. I don't think we actually ever tested or tried to test whether they checked for it or not. What we did in our earlier days, actually, this is more common in the small business space. A lot of merchants actually like the idea of having a protection seal, like a Signified protection seal on their site, to almost like show the fraudsters, hey, we're protected by Signified, don't even try it. Which I think is an interesting approach, because particular fraudsters that have dealt with like a Signified defendant kind of merchant may actually choose, going back to the entrepreneurial idea, to go somewhere else where it may be easier to do it. So we've always been like tempted to think about like a protection seal and how to make this available to merchants. Obviously, if you do code level analysis, you could find out that like a site is protected by Signified unless the merchant took any sort of measures to hide the fact that like we're the vendor behind it. So I think the fraud community is probably aware of like the different flavors of fraud protection companies out there, and how they would act. Using this as a shield could be an option for folks, but we also, I think this is why we never really explored doing this as a shield. For the consumer, it would just be confusing, because when the consumer thinks of fraud, they typically think of identity theft, fraud, and things of that nature. And that's actually something as Signified that we can't really help the consumers with, in how to mitigate and how to monitor their own credit score and reports and all of that. So when we had the badges out there, we did get a lot of inbound inquiries from consumers asking us like, hey, can you help me on that and that? Like, what should I do here and here? Or even questions about, hey, we saw you seal on this and this like website. Is that a legit merchant? Should we be shopping there? Like, so we figured it just communicated the wrong thing. But I think it's a good question. It really shows the right thinking. Like fraudsters think of like, what is the defense? Like, how easy will it be for me to get through it? And then kind of like based on that, determine whether it's worth investing there or not. The testing thing like is typically more so like merchants or fraudsters are trying to test a new exploit, like a new method of how they actually want to exploit, or maybe a new data set that they just like purchased somewhere. And they typically hit smaller merchants first, assuming that their defense is less funded, hence like less good technology, less good teams, like less SLA in place, to just prove that it first works. Then they go to something mid-market where they want to prove out that it can be scaled. So if I automated this attack, can I actually like easily scale this up? Still trying to do all of that under the radar, because again, the fraud community is also communicating. So if this pattern becomes known, like it loses the value. It's almost like the hacks on computers. To then really go into one of these larger enterprise kind of merchants to then have a fully automated, very targeted, very short-term kind of exploit to heavily monetize that, knowing that once they hit one of the big guys for a while, it's just a matter of time until their manual fraud review team actually figures this out, understands what the pattern is, and makes sure that this won't work any longer. And at that point, it probably won't work like in any of the large enterprises any longer, because that like those communities are typically sharing like their best practices as well. So one of the reasons why we actually as a company decided a lot of the guaranteed fraud protection solutions out there that may even have started in the small business space kind of moved away from that and kind of like does not include services sold to small business any longer. We actually believe not only that a solution like that is perfect for small business, because this peace of mind idea, you're an entrepreneur, you want to build a business, you don't want to become an expert in fraud. You shouldn't have to hire fraud like expertise at that an early stage. But also it is a win-win for us, because it allows us to see in our network like a lot of these early stage kind of like exploitation tests that the fraud community is actually like conducting, so that like our data scientists can see these patterns, look into those patterns, and potentially put defenses in play before we're even in the scaling, or definitely in the exploitation phase later on.
So we have another question in the chat. And again, if we don't answer your question directly, I think these are more than thorough. But if we happen to not touch on exactly what you're asking, please let us know. Talesh has another question here. Keep those questions coming. We're going to go for another 5 minutes. But if you keep the questions coming, I'll make sure we'll stay a little later. We'll get all of those answered. Talesh's next question is, does Signified report any fraud operations by scammers to law enforcement once it has been detected, confirmed? And then he asked more specifically, do you maybe report it to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police?
Right. So, I mean, we do cooperate like on a case-by-case basis, like if we're being asked. However, we are in the business of protecting merchants. We're not in the business of fighting crime. And I think this was also like a very distinct decision that we did early in our career as a company. Once you actually make it more about fighting crime, like it's almost like this whole like there are two types of people. There are the people like if crime happens that chase like the perpetrator and try to actually find them. And then the other kinds of people who stay with the victim and make sure that they're protected and nothing happens to them. Like we're more that. Like we're actually with the merchants. We will make sure that our customers won't have any harm. But we're not really like going after fighting crime. I mean, we're not the FBI. We're not like one of these entities. We're also not set up that way. Like I talked about, like fraud really is organized crime. So once you start like being known for directly chasing or trying to find or trying to identify people, you can definitely like think about like the backslash that you get from that community as well, which obviously puts everybody at the company at risk, our domain experts at risk, our employees at risk, which is something as a fraud protection company you don't have to expose yourself to. It's also a lot harder to find really who did something. It's the same as with hacking. Like to prevent like a company from being hacked is a lot easier than to try to find, like if you got hacked, to find that person and kind of like really make a case against them. It's a different kind of business that like those people are in, and those are the law enforcement people, like those are the cybercrime units that we have at the FBI's and such. And they have different methods, like access points. And from that perspective, that's not the kind of business that we're in.
And Ben Marks in the chat. Thanks for watching, Ben. It's always a pleasure having you here. He just comments that don't know how Signified could report to law enforcement when the victim is the merchant. Is that the case? Do you have any opinion on that? Like, should merchants be trying to send these to their local police, or is it actually required that the victim be the one that reports this crime?
I mean, technically, we provide our merchants with the details, like and all of the necessary information, so that they could easily actually like go to law enforcement and try to make a claim for that. If you really think about, like, I mean, the FBI when it comes to cybercrime, I think they even publicly state things like, unless there is harm of at least, I don't know where the threshold exactly is, but it was a fairly large number, like maybe $50,000 or above. Unless there is even like a harm like that, they may not even initiate any sort of investigation. So a lot of the e-commerce transactions, like the single transactions that are being like harmful for merchants, wouldn't really make the cut for like any like significant investigation anyways. So chasing that to us always felt like the wrong effort, like the wrong kind of like wrong spend time. Like really what I think, what we believe like merchants should be protected from is the harm to their business, so that they can actually go back to really focus on operating their business, not be harmed by that, be shielded from that, and then let the authorities actually deal with like long-term kind of like adjustments to how cybercrime actually is being addressed. I mean, there's a lot of things going on of like how I mean, we read this everywhere. Cybersecurity is a really hot topic these days. How breaches can be avoided, like how cyber warfare can actually be protected, like how payments can be made more secure. Payment providers themselves, like payment methods are changing. So at this point, like we're really focused in the here and now and the merchant to make sure they can operate, they can actually be successful and thrive as an e-commerce business without fear of fraud, so that they don't have to feeling that they need to put any friction in front of their buyers so that the buying experience actually is at par. Like that's really what we focus on. For that, we have to deal with the fraud side, with the criminal side, so that we understand how to protect our customers from that. But that's kind of like where we stop. Like that's when we're not trying to go overboard and really understand like in detail how they operate, how to chase them, like how to avoid, like for example, the initial breach of the data being stolen in the first place. Like there are other companies that focus on these particular aspects.
Okay, we've been going for an hour. It looks like we have all of our questions asked. Looks like maybe one just popped in here. Let me look at that. All right, I'm gonna post this question. This is the last one, and then we're going to call it an afternoon. Talesh mentions here, 2 small transactions on merchant part may not qualify, but wouldn't Signified be large enough to see greater than $50,000 worth of product being shipped to a single address? Wouldn't that warrant reporting? It's a good question. Like, do you leverage, the data across multiple merchants to see kind of a bigger trend in what's going on, and then looking at maybe, using that in your algorithm, but also, is that a potential way of reporting fraud to the authorities?
Right. I think we touched upon that like a little before. It's like what we try to avoid is aggregate things at people level. So we don't want to build profiles. Like we don't really want to have anything that would qualify as like non-transactional data. So we really focused entirely on the fact of like, is this transaction legit and can we protect it or not? So from that perspective, there is probably something like if we wanted, we could build something that would allow us to capture data in that form that will be more appropriate to actually like make a case against like a cybercrime syndicate or something. But go back to the initial set, like this is not the DNA, this is not the kind of company we're building. So we're not actually like prioritizing that in how we build product, how we store our data, how we actually analyze our data. Like it's not necessary for what we actually want to accomplish, which is to build the shield and at transactional level understand, is this a transaction that has risk or not risk? And then shield the merchant from that particular harm so that they can go back to being successful in their e-commerce business.
Okay, so we're going to call it a day. I'm almost done with my Calumet Farm. I have not really enjoyed this particular bourbon as much as maybe I thought I would. It's a beautiful bottle, but I'm almost done. I need another bottle. If you're watching this right now live, or if you happen to be catching it in reruns, post in the comments what my next bottle should be. Let me know what I should be enjoying while we're having these live streams. If you have any comments about this topic after the fact, if you missed the live stream, post it in the comments. I'll be sure to reach out to the team at Signified and get you answers on all of those. I appreciate everybody watching this Friday afternoon. Stefan, if you would, give everybody a little more information about how they can get in touch with you if they want to find out more information.
Sure. Obviously our website, signified.com, is kind of like where you find most of our information. We talked about Magenta Imagine, so we're also going to be there, have a booth. So feel free to stop by, talk to some of my colleagues. If you have any follow-up questions or more specific on like how this would work in your particular use case or in your environment. I think those are probably your best two routes. And then obviously the usual social media, you'll find some coverage from our side as well.
Have some great suggestions for different things to try. I'll have to see if I can actually find them here locally. Some things are available, some things are not. We've got a great live stream, another great live stream planned for you next week. We're going to have Peter Sheldon from Magento on, and we're going to be talking about Adobe Commerce Cloud. And that's going to be a really, really good time. We've got that one. I don't think we have anything booked at this point as far as the week after. We'll probably come on and talk about Imagine. So if you know someone that may want to kind of discuss Imagine, talk about how great of a conference it is. We don't know. This may be the last one. And so we want to make sure we are prepared for that, and we discuss it, and we give everybody an understanding of, if this is the first time, let's give them an understanding of what to look for at Imagine. Stefan, where do you know what your booth number is? You guys have a booth? How many times have you personally been to Imagine? What are your thoughts on the conference before we get off?
I think it's a good conference. I personally have never been there. Like I only heard it like from secondhand knowledge. We do have a booth. I'm honestly not sure what the number is, but like it's probably on our website in the events section. Like there should be something on Magenta Imagine. But it is a good community. I heard good things about like the vibe, the atmosphere. So everybody always looks forward to going there, but we have limited space of who can go, so it just never made the cut.
I understand that. And it's not a big exhibition space. You can find it. It's not going to be that hard if you don't know what the number is. But I appreciate you guys watching, and I look forward to seeing you next week. Of course, my exit card never works, right? Like in a second, it's just going to automatically play maybe. There we go. See y'all later.